It'll be 2 years this October that Hurricane Sandy swept across the Garden State, leaving behind a death toll in the dozens, thousands left homeless, and billions of dollars in property damage. In the next hour, we'll examine how New Jersey's doing in returning to a new normal and what we can do better to avoid such catastrophic losses into the future. Hello, I'm your host, Jim Hooker. Welcome to Resiliency, Lessons After Sandy. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests who will guide us on a tour of New Jersey's pathway back from devastation and into a more hopeful future. We welcome to the program all of you. Thanks for coming in. Mathieu Nelessen, North Jersey Regional CEO of the American Red Cross. Mathieu, welcome.
Thank you.
Cathy McCann, chair of the New Jersey Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster and, in her day job, chief operating officer of the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, if you recognize her that way. And Keith Adams, disaster recovery coordinator for the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey and Newark. Welcome all, and thanks again for coming in.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Mathieu, let's start with you on the American Red Cross with Superstorm Sandy, one of the largest Red Cross initiatives in recent history, recent memory anyway. I guess in the last 5 years it was the largest from what I understand. Yep. But you're still here working on a number of post-Sandy operations, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about that. What are you up to?
Yeah, so as we scale down our immediate response work, we immediately start kind of scaling up our long-term recovery work. So we still have staff, obviously, all over the state, and we're working on a number of things. First and foremost is managing our grants. So we've made sure that the entrusted donor dollars that we received from folks across the U.S. Are being allocated to nonprofit partners who do really, really great work. So we're managing that grants process to make sure.
Are those grants running low, or is that so you have funds to dole out into many programs into the future that you know of? Or?
So right now we're 97% committed in terms of the funds that we've raised that have been restricted to this event. So we've gotten all of our grants out to community partners, to long-term recovery groups in certain counties, and they're working right now.
What did you raise? Can you say?
Sure, yeah, $310 million.
From across the United States and the world?
Across the U.S. and the world, yeah.
Largely, where would you say?
U.S.-based. I'd probably say 30 to 40 million came from the tri-state area here.
300+ million.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, and we're 97% spent and committed at this point.
And committed to, and we have a piece of tape here showing some of that work that you're talking about that the Red Cross is doing. In this case, happens to be Little Ferry and Moonachie in Bergen County, with the organization Rebuild Together, I suppose one of those long-term groups that you're talking about. Why don't we take a quick look at that now?
I'm Mathieu Nelessen. I'm the Regional CEO for the American Red Cross here in the North Jersey region. And today we're with our partners, Rebuilding Together. And we're here in Bergen County in Little Ferry and Moonachie working on 2 homes. In this home that I'm working on, we're hanging some drywall, and it's a combination of Red Cross employees and Red Cross board members here working today. So what's great about projects like this with this home and our partnership with Rebuilding Together is we're helping to support both Rebuilding Together and this project. So it's really great to see our donor dollars at work, and it's really great to be part of that as an employee out here kind of working and swinging a hammer for the day.
So what we've seen there, Mathieu, is this typical of some of the work that we've seen Red Cross doing?
So it's typical of the work of one of our grantees. Seeing Red Cross staff going out and volunteering was a bit rare, but it was a day that I wanted to be sure that staff and board members of the Red Cross fully understood the quality of work that one of our grantees was delivering and Rebuilding Together. So we said, let's work alongside other volunteers and see what this is all about. And it's just fantastically meaningful work. And not only are our grants happening, but we also have our move-in assistance program where we're doing case management that's happening, that's all wrapping up. So all these things are happening simultaneously throughout the state.
And folks are used to seeing the Red Cross there, wonderful organization that it is. we're, I don't know if I'm normal, but the norm, you would say. Normal, we'd get an argument there. But the norm, where I think a lot of folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, see the Red Cross coming in with cots and coffee and food and things for the children, diapers or whatever, and then they think, well, then that's it, that their job is done. That's not the case, is it?
Yeah, it's absolutely not the case. So recovery is part of, so we look at disaster as a full cycle, preparedness, response, and recovery, and we're involved in all of those components of a disaster. But then I think even more importantly is that we're still responding to 3 fires a day by volunteers here in New Jersey, providing mass care, and that's that sheltering that you were talking about. We're also providing them long-term recovery planning. But then we're also 40% of the U.S. blood supply. We provide life-saving skills and training. So there's a whole host of working that we do with the military service to the armed forces. So it's it's always important for us to broaden kind of the scope of understanding about what the role is of the Red Cross, because it's so robust.
Sure. And the financial help, you mentioned it, you touched on it a couple of times here in terms of groups, long-term recovery groups. Can you give us some examples of what you're able to do there, what you've been doing there?
So, I mean, a good example is Rebuilding Together, as we saw in the clip. I mean, we granted Rebuilding Together, over $2.4 million to really identify and work with communities that were the most impacted, vulnerable communities, to make sure that they're, put themselves on a path to sustainable housing. And really, that was a focus of ours when it came to our grants, really focused on the housing component of recovery.
And you were in Moonachie and Little Ferry there, but you imagine you're all over the state, obviously. And a lot of folks, I talked about my view of the Red Cross, which might have been primitive in some ways. It's just the general thing, but same goes maybe for Sandy, Cathy, in terms of folks thinking it primarily hit the shore. And yet here we are, inland by some miles, right? Even in Bergen County, North Jersey.
Right.
So it wasn't just the shore, right? And it's all over New Jersey.
It really affected every county in some way, but pretty much 9 counties drastically, that were FEMA declared counties. So that was really important, so that they know that there's also rivers and tributaries and the Bay areas.
And that's what happened in Moonachie and Little Ferry, the river.
Correct, correct.
Well, Jim, I think a good example of that is how Matthew's organization, the Red Cross, and the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey are partnered together, where we're working in Gloucester, Salem, and Cumberland counties and Camden County, which most people don't think of as affected.
No, those you don't hear a lot about.
But we're actually working down there, and we're one of the nonprofits that the Red Cross is supported with a grant, where we're meeting unmet needs. And unmet needs are those things that property loss, things that after folks apply their assurance and FEMA payments or other programs are kind of left without, and we're able to come in and support them. But here again,
give us a hard example of somebody who was, say, either renting an apartment or maybe owned a home, and you come in and help them in what way?
Well, we mostly work with for low and moderate income folks, the most vulnerable. We know that disaster doesn't affect everyone equally. So if you or I were affected by a disaster in our home, we're most likely insured, or we have some resources, hopefully, that we can pay. But if we were a family who was struggling before the storm, and then we had this happen, if we're a renter, for instance, so our landlord's responsible for taking care of our apartment or whatever. We may have moved out and found other housing, but the landlord's not responsible for my couch or my bed or my kids' toys, or maybe that appliance that I had. And that's a way that we can come alongside of these folks and hopefully replace them and put them where they were before the storm.
Now, Cathy, you're in that volunteer organizations active in disaster, right?
Yes,
so
New Jersey VOAD.
Do you also work with, say, Keith's Episcopal Diocese and the Red Cross, or is
both of them are part of VOAD. You don't hear VOAD going out and doing anything. You're hearing the Episcopal go out and do things. You're hearing about Red Cross and Salvation Army and 211 and all these different organizations. Your Methodist Church. All of those organizations are part of VOAD, and same with the Community Food Bank. We all go out and do our own thing, but what we do ahead of time, hopefully, is to coordinate and collaborate, cooperate, and communicate, coordinate, collaborate, and cooperate together. So that we are not duplicating services, that, you know, we're not opening a shelter in one place, and maybe the Episcopals are opening it someplace else, and we're not feeding.
I don't think people would realize that this kind of work goes into these.
No, they
this
don't.
kind of planning goes in.
Because we had a lot of duplication of services after Sandy. Down the shore, those communities didn't have a local county VOAD or co-ed, and so therefore, this church started feeding and this church started feeding until they started to communicate together. They realized we don't all both have to do this. One of us could do this, or you do it 2 days a week, we'll do it 3 days a week. And
you're a great supporter of these VOADs. You say that they need to be everywhere, basically. Disasters, in your words, maybe you were misquoted, I doubt it.
No, disasters are local.
Go ahead.
Start local and end local.
And by that you mean?
Because the first ones at the disaster are those, your neighbors. Everybody's there together. At the end, when FEMA pulls away, when you know the shelters are closed, when everything else happens, when the response is done, when the fire trucks go back into their houses and things like that, the community is left there. And so the faith-based groups, the organizations that are there, and so in the long-term recovery and the unmet needs, that's where we have to help the community. So it really winds up with them. So whether it's volunteers, bringing volunteers in to help, or feeding, or you know putting a food box out, because if you were, as Keith was saying, if you're a paycheck away before this storm happens from being in the poorhouse, then this really affects you.
This would knock you in
That's right,
quickly
right.
and for a long time.
Right, and you have to take time off to fix your home and do all that kind of stuff. So helping people, and so the community needs to recover the community.
Matthew, you wanted to add something?
No, I just want to say, just to recognize, Cathy, the food bank does, not the food banks, but the VOAD does an incredible amount of work behind the scenes. So, what you see some really great coordination in New Jersey between some lead nonprofit agencies, but the amount of work that, the leadership in terms of the VOAD is able to convene pre-storm is so important. And that's, I think, collectively, we were talking about it before we started taping, is that it's going to be our work now post-Sandy is to say, let's try and continue and get those VOADs up in every one of the 21 counties, and let's start to convene. Let's start to get folks around the table and start to map out some level of planning. We know no disaster is alike, but let's at least have these folks exchange business cards, get on the same page, so when it does hit,
I mean, that's what it's about, right? I mean, it's about, we say this all the time when we sell VOAD, and that is, it's about relationships. So it's when it happens that I say, I have a need here for beds. I know that Matthew has beds. Who's got drinking water? Cathy's got drinking water, and that's who I can call. Who maybe can bring, some food.
Of course, some of that, as I think all three of you are saying, has to happen before the storm rolls in, right?
So I think it's not even before the storm. So it's a continuous process of relationship. So one of my key things that I always go out and I tell new VOAD groups starting is that, so we're involved in long-term recovery, because that's where a lot of these folks are right now. But I say, look, you know what? Every day is a disaster for somebody in New Jersey. And I love using that when I'm out of state because I always get a laugh. But it is. Somebody has lost their home. Like Michael pointed out, or Matthew pointed out, there is a fire every day that the Red Cross is responding to and helping folks. So every day somebody loses a job, something happens. And all of us as agencies like the American Red Cross and the faith-based community, we're always responding to those types of emergencies. So it's just a case, how do we extend what we do every day into a bigger picture? And VOAD is a national organization, and faith-based groups like my own, American Red Cross, Salvation Army, and other large partners, when we bring resources into an area that has a major disaster, we're looking for that VOAD as a framework to kind of come into.
Cathy is the chair, so we're going to put it on her for now, of the New Jersey Volunteer Organization Active in Disaster. That's the VOAD that we're talking about. How does somebody start one of those? Are there blotches on the map where they don't exist now, and suppose somebody at home is looking and say, well,
Well, there are state VOADs, and there's
started
county VOADs. And many years ago, we tried to start county VOADs, and people would come together, and then they wouldn't see, well, nothing ever happens in New Jersey. Well, now it's happened. So people realize there are counties that have very strong VOADs. Bergen County, Somerset County, they have strong VOADs because they've had disasters. maybe not always federally declared disasters, but they've had disasters, whether it's
Such-
flooding or
yeah, I was gonna say, such as-
such as Floyd, or Floyd was
Sure.
declared, but there's been flooding in the spring in Patterson and Bergen and Somerset counties, and those VOADs had to come together. People, organizations, we need to learn to trust each other and work with each other.
Don't
That's
tell
a
me
big
that
thing.
you guys who do God's work, as I like to say, have silos and protected realms and things like that, as some other groups might. I won't name any names.
Well, you know, we're all going after the dollars, or the donated dollars, the donated goods for our own organization, for our everyday. But in a disaster, we need to work together, because you know what? None of us can do this alone. And whether it's a disaster, or as Keith was saying, whether it's an individual disaster, none of us can do this alone. We need to work together, and when we work together, we become stronger. A stronger community, we become a stronger state, we become stronger organizations.
Matthew.
This is a really important point, because New Jersey has 38,000 registered nonprofits, and everyone wants to get involved when a disaster hits. And one of the great things here is that PSC&G is a great philanthropic funder, as is Verizon and other organizations who sit right here in New Jersey. When we're on the same page in terms of doing some of this work about collaborating and knowing what resources we need, we can go as a unified front also to a funder, and it makes that funding quicker to turn on. But at the end of the day, there's the other side of that, where there are 38,000 registered
How
nonprofits,
do
and
you
we all
divvy it
have
up,
to
though?
fundraise.
How do you divvy it up, right?
So you have your blue sky budget that you have to hit, but when the disaster hits, you really want to be quick about going to PSC&G to say, hey, we need resources here to get food, to get cots, to get case managers out into the streets, and that's a challenge.
And because we're talking together as organizations, I can tell you before a disaster what I have in inventory in my warehouse. And sometimes I warehouse Red Cross blankets, or water, or meals ready to eat, or heater meals, or something like that, or Salvation Army cleanup kits and Church World Service cleanup kits. We can, if I have space and we can be prepared for a disaster, I'll put them in my warehouse.
And then Keith
And
doesn't
then
have to fundraise to get
To go find them and whatever.
He can concentrate on something else.
But we can also say, we're working together. Funders love to hear that we're collaborating and working together, because they don't want their dollars. They don't want to be wasting their dollars and
Right.
duplicating services
Duplicating, right. Said earlier.
with different. Yes, so we can say this needs to go to the long-term recovery, because that's where the money is needed. If it's a federally declared disaster, then the money goes. That FEMA goes first. There's a whole sequence of delivery. That insurance, FEMA, and then the state funding if there's any, and then it's left up to us to do the unmet needs, whatever's left, with volunteers and with funds.
You've stated publicly, Cathy, I believe, that you have concerns about, and we're going there now, you talk about what you have and what you need, and blue sky times, and then for a storm. You've stated publicly that you have concerns about dealing with a, quote, second disaster, if there is one, or when there is one. What do you mean by that? In what
Well,
ways?
the second disaster is sometimes things that happen after a disaster, when people start collecting things like clothing and furniture, and saying, well, right away people want to do something, and they don't necessarily want to give money, but they want to do something, so they collect whatever, used clothing, and it comes in. And that creates a second disaster, because where do you put it? The disaster zone is already congested. Sometimes it's cordoned off. You can't do anything. And us as nonprofits, if somebody brings me a truckload of food and clothing, I can't deal with the clothing. I can deal with the food and take it in, but it has to be sorted. It has to be checked. It has to be clothing. Clothing can become, and many times people are in shelters, or they're in temporary housing. They have no place to put this clothing.
So what do you do with that in those instances? Do you send it away? Do you send
Sometimes
it back
you have to-
somewhere?
sometimes
Who
you have
brings
to
it to you? A truckload of
Well,
stuff.
we had
Would it
people
be-
who actually came in unsolicited donations. We received a tractor trailer load of T-shirts and flip-flops, which seems really appropriate for the Jersey Shore, except that our disaster was at the end of October.
Beginning of November.
2 weeks after the storm, when
You needed
this
blankets.
is coming, we actually had snow on the ground. So, good intentions, and one of the things that we talk about all the time, and this applies to volunteers and it applies to donated goods, and that is that my help can't define your need. And that's what happens when we get this, and we do have this, we had to put manpower and logistics
Sorting
into sorting and how we're going to deal with all
You
this.
can't just say, go back to where you came from, Mr. Truck or Mrs. Truck Driver?
You know, people do this with
You know,
good intention,
yeah,
but
it
when
is.
it's
In a nice way, I'm
hard,
sorry.
But when
yeah.
it's coming from Ohio and somebody has driven here from Ohio, you know,
Right.
does it
So
take
then
every
you're on the
community?
phone with Keith saying, Keith,
right.
can you take this? Or
Right.
Matthew.
And-
We
and-
would,
Salvation
we would all
Army.
solution around it. I mean,
Right.
at the end of the day, we all found solutions to make sure this stuff got to the
But
folks
it took
who
a lot
needed
of time
it.
and energy.
Right.
a lot of time and
and
energy that you
energy.
shouldn't be.
And you also have to be proactive about your messaging. So on our side, you know, you said we got to communicate to our local elected officials that clothing's not something that we're going to collect.
Right.
What we need is
Send gift
cash,
cards, you know.
so we can turn that cash into investing in the local economy and getting those resources to the clients that need them the most quickly.
Or when we needed sweatshirts and stuff like that, we were able, as a group, as VOAD, to say these are our needs. We need warm clothing,
Yeah.
and so somebody donated brand new sweatsuits
So,
and
so,
socks.
so
and
speaking about that, that's one of the exciting things that VOAD's involved in right now.
Yeah.
One of the initiatives is to have kind of a one-stop website where folks can
Mm-hmm.
come. And it's been done in other states where if there's a disaster, they could come and, you know, I don't know whether it's going to be, you know, Help New Jersey or whatever it's going to be .com.
we hope that's
but-
what it'll be, but it's not developed yet. But
But
those
you
are
know
the lessons
that's
learned.
the idea, so people can see. And I think as we have more disasters across the U.S., is folks are starting to get that idea too, because other communities are experiencing this. But you know, if I had a message for anybody, if there's another disaster, and that is, yeah, send us gift cards, send us something that we can give to people.
Of course,
that's gonna
some
be flexible.
people, as Kathy said, maybe they can't afford
Yeah.
cash or whatever. They want to do something.
But then collect the clothes in your local community, have a rummage sale, and then send the cash.
Cash.
There you
Or
go.
something.
There's
There's
an
some,
idea.
some ways.
Right.
Or if you can't do anything, because volunteer in your own community and do it in the name of the people who are affected. There's
Yeah.
all kinds of ways I think that we can, you know, when you're in Ohio or California and you used to be in New Jersey and you can feel, you know, you feel that you need to, you
Right.
want to do something. And so maybe if you could do something in your own community without taking, or without getting in the car and driving across. I'll tell you, after 9/11, we had people that drove across the country and came here, I'm here to help.
Yeah.
And now,
You
then we
didn't
had to
have
find,
anything for them to do.
we had nothing for them to do. New York was locked down.
Yeah.
How do we house these people? How do we feed these people? Then it was left on the nonprofits to deal with all these college students who,
What did you
just
do?
came in. Some of them we put to work, and some of them we just said, you
Don't
know,
have anything.
we
Thanks,
don't
Will.
really have anything.
How-
Unless you're a contractor and you're working with somebody else.
How about post
No.
Sandy? You had people from Michigan and, well, I don't know why I bring up Michigan, but there's a number of states around the country, right, that came over to help. Church groups,
But every
faith-based groups.
Every faith-based group, and many people who are
Right.
of a denomination don't realize that their national organization has a
Yes.
disaster plan and is part of National VOAD. If they knew that, they would contact them and find out, and then schedule a time to come in.
But is that what happens? I mean, what happened after Sandy? You recall after 9/11, apparently thousands of folks, and or some hundreds or whatever that you couldn't use. Did you see some of that same thing after post Sandy? Did you see a flood of volunteers?
We saw some people coming in and trying to help and wanting to do cleanup, and sometimes they would just show up at the shore and start shoveling. Well, first of all, there's no liability insurance for them. They're not covered if something happened to them. You know, they're not hooked in with a group. We don't know who they are. You know, they haven't been vetted. You know, it's you know, it can be scary in a community to have somebody come in. That's why we try to work through the faith-based groups and organizations that work with volunteers on a regular basis,
We
and
have
make
met-
sure that they're trained beforehand and that they know what they're getting into.
We talked
before they
about
get
some of
here.
that in an earlier panel. Yeah, trained so they don't hurt themselves on the job and that type of
Or
stuff.
hurt anybody else or do any damage.
So I think most of the major faith-based groups understand that now
Yes.
and have a good, because we've had so many disasters. We had Katrina in Louisiana, which obviously taught us a lot about this. But every major denomination, really, and I shouldn't just say denomination because also there's things like Islamic Circle and
Any house of
Jewish
worship.
Federation, all the houses of worship now, pretty
Faith-based,
much
right?
all the faith-based community has a place to go. And the Episcopal Church, it runs through the Episcopal Relief and Development Agency. We have a regional volunteer coordinator, so if you had a church group, when I first came on the job, we weren't, completely built out with that position, so I was getting those calls, and I had folks going, well, I'm somebody from Texas, and I want to bring my youth up here, and I had to tell them no, because we weren't ready to rebuild, and we weren't ready to rebuild safely.
And then when you were you able to get back to
And
them?
then we were able to get back to them and use them appropriately. So.
In terms of the faith-based, I read Keith, where your Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey is the second oldest Episcopal in the nation, right?
Yes.
So is this a new phenomenon, or have faith-based groups always been involved, as far as you know, in terms of helping post-disaster?
I think, faith-based groups have always been involved, helping past disaster, because they start in the local community. Churches and other houses of worship are typically the places that people go first to look for help. So I think almost all the major...
In terms of like an organized way.
Organized way?
You have a position in that. There's a
right.
whole
So
structure as it were.
Right, and I can't speak for everybody, but this is pretty close to the Presbyterians have Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, the Lutherans have Lutheran Social Ministries, or Disaster Ministries, United
Catholic
Methodist
Charities,
has UMCOR, Catholic Charities, and in our case...
Now we're going to get in trouble because we're going to leave somebody out.
We're going to leave somebody out, but almost every major denomination has some type of framework in place. Mm-hmm. In our case, it's Episcopal Relief and Development, which is our worldwide mission.
And we have to go back, as you name all of these, I go back to what you all were saying, and Cathy especially, since she's the chair of that group. All of these folks have to be coordinated post or pre, so that, as you said, otherwise a shelter is operating within...
We need to be talking together.
And do they?
We need to make our plans and talk. We just had a conference in May, and there were over 500 people there at the National VOAD conference. And so anybody that wants to look up on VOAD, it's nvoad.org, and you'll see nvoad.org. And you will see all of the different organizations. Most of them are faith-based. There are some non-faith-based. There's the humane societies, and every aspect of rebuilding together. It was not necessarily a faith-based group, but all these different organizations who are parts. And we do have to work together. And many different ones have different places in the disaster. Some are in recovery, and some work in recovery.
Matthew?
Yeah, there's a good understanding of the roles. So the Red Cross is the ESF 6 Emergency Support Function, 6 for mass care. So we're the co-lead of that function. So we work with groups like the Salvation Army and other nonprofits. And Cathy's food bank has a very different role than we do, but we partner and we understand what our roles are, and we complement one another. And then I just want to touch on the volunteer piece. Is that we had 4,000 volunteers in New Jersey on the ground. Some of them are centrally trained, dispatched to come here pre-landfall for an event, but we also have a really great intake system they're called spontaneous or event-based volunteers. So we have the ability to intake, do a training, do a background check, and dispatch them to a function, all within a few hours. So you have to have those processes set up in order to get these volunteers out into good roles that they're going to enjoy, benefit, and do good work.
Let me just stop you there for a moment. We'll pick this up on the other side of the break. We are going to take a short break right now. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us.